center. Does it work? No. Okay. Yeah, I will talk about musical dynamics and how it is constructed out of acoustical features and what the role of timbre is in this context. So originally we were, of course, the first thing you think of when it comes to musical dynamics, which we define as an expressive state that can be something between fortissimo and pianissimo. The first thing you think of is, of course, loudness. So our original interest was to document the measured loudness ranges that musical instruments can reach. And to measure the power of a musical instrument, you can of course not measure sound pressure levels because they are influenced from what side you look at the instrument, how far away you are from the instrument, and also includes the contribution of the performance room. So the only reliable measure for the power of an instrument is the sound power, so the sound that is radiated in all directions. And for that you need some measurement effort, so you put an enclosed surface of microphones, in this case a spherical microphone array with 32 microphones, which you see here at the intersections around the instrument, and then you can measure a sound power level in decibel that includes the radiation into all directions. We did this for all standard orchestral instruments, plus some popular instruments such as saxophones or guitar. And we did this for modern instruments, but also for historical versions, so violins as they were used at Beethoven's time or even in the Baroque era, by inviting orchestras that use an historically informed performance practice. So there were musicians from the Berlin Professional Orchestra, the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, and all musicians from the Akademie für Alte Musik, which is one of the most successful historical performance practice ensembles. So what we got then is for the complete chromatic range of the instrument, a value for pianissimo and a value for fortissimo in sound power level. So here are two examples. What you see is that for some instruments the range between fortissimo and pianissimo is not very large. So for the flute in the low register, it's not more than 5 decibel difference. Increases a little with pitch. The range is much higher for the violin. And for string instruments in general, it's quite independent of pitch. So this is a map of all the dynamic ranges of the instruments, both in the modern version, the blue boxes and the red boxes for the historical instruments. You see that some instruments have a quite narrow range, so the oboe reaches not more than about 20 decibel between fortissimo and pianissimo, whereas the clarinet, for example, reaches almost 60 dB difference. What was surprising immediately was that there is not much difference between the historical and the modern instruments. So there's no difference at all for string instruments. Only for brass instruments you see that the modern versions have a wider dynamic range, so they can play softer and louder compared to their historical versions. Of course, we all know that musical dynamics is not only a matter of loudness, but also of timbre, of the spectral distribution. That has, of course, physical reasons. For example, the reed of an oboe has much more nonlinear components in forte, which leads to an increase of higher partials, something which you immediately recognize when you hear the tone playing. Can we have it a little louder, please? So that's pianissimo, and this is. So what you expect is an increase in high frequency partials. And the contribution of timbre and loudness to dynamic strength has, for example, investigated by Michael Fabiani and Anders Friberg on the perceptual in the perceptual domain. So they presented notes for 6 musical instruments which were systematically varied in loudness, timbre, and pitch to subjects, and let them rate the dynamic intensity here on the y-axis. And what you see for these 2 instruments, for example, that for the trumpet, the perceived dynamics does not very much depend on pitch. So for these 3 octaves, no systematic increase. It varies, of course, with loudness, which you see here as low, mid, and high. And it also varies with the timbre that corresponds to these loudnesses. And they reached this by manipulating the absolute loudness and taking the recorded fortissimo and brought it to the loudness of the recorded pianissimo to have a systematic variation between the 2 parameters. And what you see is that even if you increase only the spectral distribution from piano to fortissimo, there is an increase in perceived dynamics, although there's no difference in absolute loudness. And as a numerical measure for the contribution of the 2 parameters, they calculated a 3-way analysis of variance and measured the contribution with eta squared, which is something like r squared, so the explained variance between the different dynamic strengths. And then you have instruments like trumpet and violin where you have no systematic variation with pitch, so less than 10% explained variance, and you have almost similar contributions of loudness and timbre to the perceived dynamics. You have other instruments where the loudness component is the dominant contribution, for example for the flute and for the piano, whereas the other 2 parameters are almost equal. And then you have instruments like the clarinet, where the absolute loudness is the least important parameter, and perceived dynamics is much more dominated by timbre and pitch. So we did something similar, with the difference that we did not investigate perceived dynamic strengths, but we investigated how the notes that we recorded in 2 dynamic extremes are acoustically constituted by sound power, by pitch, and by spectral distribution. And to measure spectral distribution, we used the Timbre toolbox, which was published by Dr. Peters a couple of years ago. So to formulate the research question a little bit more precise, we investigated to what extent can the intended, or what would say the performed, dynamic strength be predicted by these 3 parameters. We also calculated a model to see to what extent only pitch and timbre can classify dynamic strength. Why those 2 calculations? Of course, sound power is nothing that you can directly perceive for exactly the reasons that I told you at the beginning. It depends on the distance and the room. But of course, with some musical experience, with the knowledge of the instrument, with the knowledge of the behavior of performance rooms, you can at least estimate the sound power. But that depends on the experience that you have. So even in a concert, and the more so if you listen to recorded music, you might not have any loudness information. And And then it would be interesting to see to what extent pitch and timbre alone will allow you to differentiate between the dynamic extremes. And the other point we were interested in, which audio features from this collection in the timbre toolbox are the best predictors for this classification. Yeah, most of you might know the timbre toolbox is a collection of many audio features, of which we chose only the time-varying descriptors. We used only the stationary part of the notes and applied this part of the toolbox in all different versions of implementation, which I don't want to go into details, but all in all, there are 65 audio features that we use. And that makes the statistical analysis a little more complex, because many of those features are, of course, highly correlated among each other. So we have the problem of multi-collinearity. That's why we chose a two-way process. And in the first step, we applied discriminant analysis in order to select the most appropriate audio features, which we then put into a linear model to predict dynamic strength. So what does it mean? What you see here is the collection of all recorded notes, about 2,500 notes for different instruments and different pitches. And what you see is that sound power alone does not allow you to reliably classify dynamics. So if you would put a plane separating the two distributions here, you would see some overlap. And with the discriminant analysis, you try to use more than this single parameter to find such a plane for separation. And the discriminant analysis revealed three audio features which were significantly increasing the classification power. For the model that included sound power, these were spectral skewness, spectral crest and frame energy. And for the model without sound power, it was spectral spread, spectral skewness, and spectral decrease. I will explain only these first two because they are the most important ones, and spectral skewness also in both models. So what is spectral spread and spectral skewness? If we again have a look at the two spectra for the oboe, we see that the spectral distribution gets wider in fortissimo. So if you would calculate a standard deviation around the spectral centroid as the center of gravity of the distribution, it would be quite narrow for pianissimo, and it would be much wider. So the spectral centroid moves from the third partial to the fifth partial, and the standard deviation gets larger. That's what the spectral spread tells us. Spectral skewness describes whether the center of gravity lies in the center of the distribution or whether it lies at the left or the right of the distribution. So here you see that it is a quite symmetrical distribution because the contribution of these higher partials is not very high. Here it's different. Here you see that the center of gravity is much more left of the whole distribution. So it's a quite obvious contribution. The more interesting question is what would the actual numerical contribution be? And the effect on the discriminant analysis you can see here. So if you use only sound power, the separating plane would be somewhere here with a large overlap. If you use also spectral skewness, you can move the plane a little upwards, and you have a much better separation between the two distributions. So after identifying, this is for the model with sound power, and this is the model without sound power, where spectral skewness and spectral spread together allow for a good classification of the two distributions also. So now we put these features into a generalized linear model. A generalized linear model is an extension of a multiple regression model with the difference that it also allows for non-normal distributions and also for non-equal variances of the response variable. And a generalized linear mixed model allows to calculate both fixed effects and random effects, what I will explain in a moment. So what you see is that if you use sound power alone, you reach a predictive power of either 64 or 96%. And what is the difference? The marginal R squared describes the power of the fixed effects model. So if you have one model for all musical instruments, whereas the conditional R squared describes a random effects model where every instrument can have a different model with different contributions of the parameters pitch, timbre, and loudness. So if you allow for the specific identity of the instrument, you could say, and if you translate it to perception, you can say, if I know the identity of the instrument and how pitch, power, and timbre change for this instrument, I can already with sound power alone completely decide whether it's forte or piano. Whereas if I don't have this information, either because it's not transmitted, if I listen to a CD and put it very soft, or if I listen to those instruments for the first time, I need additional spectral information to reach at least 81% predictive power. The second model, without loudness, the same picture, the conditional R squared is if you take these two predictors, reaches also more than 90%, and it's a little less if you don't consider the identity of the instrument. So if we conclude, we can say that with a full set of basic acoustical features, and that's what I would describe the features that we use, so there's not much cultural or musical experience or learning included. It's just spectrum, sound power, and pitch. The dynamic strength is a very reliable parameter. So the impression can be generated almost certainly for specific instruments and even quite certain for orchestral instruments in general. With loudness information alone, only if you know the instrument, you can reach the same classification reliability. If you would try to use a model for all musical instruments, it's not quite reliable. And without loudness information, taking two spectral audio features and knowing the behavior of the instrument gives you almost the same classification power as you have if you have loudness additional. And what this means, or what this explains, is that even if you listen to a CD with absolutely artificial loudness, you can recognize the sound power. That's something that we know from experience, I think, but we can also explain it with very elementary audio features. And the last remark for the musicologists, it was surprising that historical instruments only have a slightly lower sound power. So on average, it was 1 decibel than modern instruments, and the difference in spectral distribution can be described with a slightly more flat spectral shape. Thank you.
Yes, again. Again. I really expected to see the spectral centroid not spectral spread and spectral skewness, but since they're highly correlated, at least in my experience, does that mean that you could, like, in your data, could you replace either of those with the spectral centroid and get similar results? Or is the spectral centroid a bad predictor in that case?
I think the spectral centroid is a bad predictor if you control for pitch. That's the reason. If you would not control for pitch, it would certainly show up. But it varies so systematically with pitch that it gives no additional information as soon as you have control for pitch in the model.
A question related to, because you have some measures or some models that characterize the entire breadth of instruments as opposed to just single instruments or even instrument groups.
Yeah, these were the
recommendations?
The marginal R squares. This is the general model describing the whole center.
Of all instruments.
Of all
And
instruments.
you wouldn't expect that it works for some instruments in a different way than others in terms of how
Well,
much
it does.
variation is
That's why the prediction is better if you allow for individual models for each instrument than for the complete sample.
And what's the influence of source directivity in terms of instruments? I guess you measured in an anechoic room, you just measured the sound power. But did you also take into account how these instruments might be radiating sound primarily, that energy into certain directions, preferential directions, that certain frequency?
Well, I mean, we measured directivity. That was actually the original reason to do this. But as I said, of course, we can very well now describe how the spectrum will change when you listen to the violin from behind instead of from before. But for a normal listener in a performance situation, it's also not only directivity. I mean, the room acoustics plays a major role. That's often underrated in this context. So that's why I said the truth is somewhere between the loudness, the power including model and the model without power. That's where you are in practice, in reality. And the fact that it makes a difference where you sit was not systematically investigated in this study. But it's quite straightforward.
So is there any way to compare the generic model and the instrument-specific model? Is there anything that can be learned from this improvement that happens when you customize the model?
Well, I think different things. I mean, one application would, of course, you could think of is a synthesis model. So how to synthesize dynamics. And it would certainly be recommended to use different models for different instruments to reach a reliable impression of synthesis. And what it also explains is, of course, that for listeners who are familiar with this specificity, there's a much more reliable perception of dynamic strength.
No, but what I mean is if one were to look at the weights of each of the different features get in this model, in the generic version and the specific one, is there any pattern that emerges as far as group of instruments?
Well, what we did not use is different models in terms of different parameters. So it were the same parameters only with different weights. You could, of course, start to construct different models for different instruments. We did this not systematically, but and then again, of course, you would get other audio features for certain instruments. That's true. But then that's a lot of data. 30 instruments.
Was there a question there?
It got answered.
It's going to be answered. Any more questions? Okay. Can I ask one? I thought there might be some. A lot of the parameters were quite spectral or derived from the spectrum. I wondered, like, I was thinking of like a shaky bow for the very quiet ones. I was wondering if there might be anything of a more temporal nature to measure, or do you not need that?
Well, we did not investigate that. Well, that's the only reason. Also because, well, no, I don't want to speculate. I mean, of course, we all know that there is a temporal component of Timbre, so this considers only the stationary spectral distribution.
Do you want to say there's a coffee break? No, shall I say there's a coffee break? I think we're on a little late, so it's about a 20-minute coffee break. Meeting back for a punctual 5. Great.